Every flight begins with a gamble against physics. You are at your heaviest, pushing your engines to the limit, trusting that the air will hold you, but sometimes the ground refuses to let go. In this video, we analyzed 9 tragic takeoffs where the flight ended before it truly began. We look beyond the wreckage of the Paris Concorde, a jumbo jet speeding blindly down the wrong runway in a typhoon, and the fatal errors of ice and flaps. We examine the moments where engineering met catastrophe. This is Terra Obscura. If you want calm, in-depth documentaries like this, please like and subscribe. Help us keep real aviation history alive. Spanair Flight 5022 was a holiday flight that never made it out of Madrid. On 20 August 2008, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 was scheduled to fly from Madrid Barajas to Las Palmas with 172 people on board. It was a hot summer afternoon. The airplane pushed back, taxied out, and lined up on runway 36 left for its first attempt at departure. As they prepared to take off the first time, a warning light came on for a small sensor called the RAM air temperature probe. It was not a critical system for flight, but the airline's procedures required the crew to return to the gate. They taxied back in, passengers stayed on board, and maintenance came to look at the problem. The fix was simple on paper. Pull a circuit breaker to deactivate the heater for that probe and defer it. On this airplane, though, that breaker was on a panel that also fed power to the takeoff warning system, the set of horns and synthetic voices that shout at the crew if they try to take off in an unsafe configuration. After the breaker was pulled and the paperwork signed, the jet was cleared again. No one realized that the takeoff warning system had lost power, and no one performed a full, functional check that would have exposed it. From the passenger's point of view, it was just an annoying delay on a hot day inside a crowded cabin. The airplane pushed back a second time and taxied out once more for departure. This is where routine turned dangerous. During taxi, the crew should have extended the flaps and slats, the movable panels on the wings that increase lift at low speed. It is a standard step on the taxi checklist. On the Spanair flight that day, the checklist was rushed and partly done from memory. The line that calls for flaps and slats was effectively skipped. The lever stayed at 0. Outside, the wings remained clean, with no extra lift devices deployed. Normally, the takeoff warning system is the last safety net for this kind of error. If the pilots push the thrust levers forward with the flaps and slats still up, a loud horn sounds, and they abort the takeoff. But with the circuit breaker pulled, the system that should have screamed at them was dead quiet. Cleared for departure, the jet turned onto runway 36 left and began its roll. The engines accelerated, the airplane gathered speed, and the crew rotated at the calculated point. Despite the wrong configuration, the MD-82 did manage to leave the ground. It lifted off, but with far less lift than it should have had for the same speed and weight. Almost immediately, the climb began to decay. The airplane struggled to gain height. The nose was up. The engines were producing power, but the speed was not there. The wing was close to its critical angle of attack. Seconds after liftoff, the stall warning system activated, shaking the control column. Instead of smoothly lowering the nose to regain speed, the pilot flying pulled back further, trying to climb away. The wing stalled fully, the left wing dropped, and the airplane rolled and sank. Spanair Flight never got far from the airport boundary. It slammed into the ground just beyond the runway, crossed a small road, and broke apart in a dry ravine. The fuselage split and burned. Thick black smoke rose above Barajas on what should have been an ordinary summer afternoon departure. Rescue crews reached the wreckage quickly, but the impact forces and post-crash fire were extreme. Out of 172 people on board, 154 died. Only 18 survived, many with serious injuries. For Spain, it was one of the worst air disasters in decades. For investigators, the story that emerged was not about a single dramatic mistake, but about the devil in the routine, how a common maintenance deferral, a silent warning system, and a missed checklist item could line up on a busy day and leave a modern jet trying to take off with its wings effectively still in cruise mode. The crash of Spanair Flight led to changes in how airlines handle deferred defects, how takeoff warning systems are powered and checked, and how crews are trained to treat checklists as non-negotiable, even when they have just done the same taxi to the same runway only an hour before. Air Florida Flight 90 was supposed to be a simple winter flight to Florida. On January 13, 1982, a Boeing 737 sat at Washington National Airport, ready to depart for Fort Lauderdale with a stop in Tampa. There were 79 people on board, 74 passengers and 5 crew. Outside, a heavy snowstorm covered the city. The Potomac River beside the airport was a field of broken ice. Because of the storm, the airport closed for a time, then reopened. Flight 90 was sprayed with de-icing fluid at the gate, but after that, the airplane waited in falling snow and slush longer than planned. As they taxied out, the crew used reverse thrust behind other jets, hoping the hot exhaust from aircraft ahead would help clear remaining snow. In reality, that choice blew slush and ice back onto the wings and into the engines. They also also left the engine anti-ice system off, even though the temperature and visible moisture clearly called for it. On the way to the runway, the first officer noticed that the engine power readings did not look right for the conditions. The numbers were too high for the way the engines sounded and felt. He mentioned it, but the captain pressed on. There had already been delays. Snow was still falling. Instead of stopping to recheck the engines or return for more de-icing, they continued toward takeoff. When the tower cleared them, the 737 rolled down the slushy runway, and the captain advanced the thrust levers. Because ice had built up on engine probes, the instruments showed higher power than the engines were really producing. At the same time, a thin layer of ice and snow remained on the wings, quietly destroying lift. The crew thought they had full thrust and clean wings. They had neither. The airplane reached rotation speed and lifted off. Almost immediately, the climb felt wrong. The jet struggled to gain height. The speed stopped increasing. Stall warnings sounded as the wings, coated in contamination and fed by reduced power, could not make enough lift. Just beyond the end of the runway, the 14th Street Bridge crossed the Potomac, full of cars and buses moving slowly in the snow. With barely any climb performance left, Flight 90 sank toward the bridge. The landing gear and lower fuselage slammed into the guardrail and vehicles. Several cars and a truck were crushed. 4 people on the bridge were killed. The impact tore pieces off the wings and fuselage. Then the jet slid off the edge, broke apart and plunged into the frozen river. Most of the airplane disappeared under the ice. Only a section of the tail and part of the cabin remained above the water, surrounded by jagged pieces of ice and fuel film. A handful of survivors managed to escape their seats and reach open windows. They clung to wreckage and water just above freezing, unable to swim far or pull themselves onto stable ice. On the shore and the bridge, people watched in shock. Emergency vehicles fought through snow and traffic to reach the riverbank. Even when they arrived, rescuers could not simply wade out through the ice. The current was strong. Anyone who went in risked quickly losing strength and disappearing under broken ice. A United States Park Police helicopter arrived and began hovering low over the river. The crew lowered a rescue line again and again toward the survivors in the water. In the end, only 5 people from the airplane survived. 74 passengers and crew, plus 4 people on the bridge, lost their lives. The images that went around the world were not only of wreckage, they showed a torn tail standing in a field of ice, a helicopter hovering inches above the water, and exhausted survivors being dragged across snow and broken ice to the shore. Investigators later found no single hidden defect that made the crash unavoidable. The key causes were human and procedural. The crew took off with ice on critical surfaces, did not use engine anti-ice, trusted power readings from iced probes, and did not reject the takeoff when their instruments looked wrong. Ground de-icing practices and training also fell short of what the conditions demanded. Out of the Potomac disaster came stricter rules for winter operations across the United States. Airlines tightened de-icing procedures, changed checklists, and reinforced a simple rule for crews. If there is any doubt about contamination on the wings, the airplane does not leave the ground. Air France Flight 4590 was supposed to be the start of a luxury holiday. On 25 July 2000, a Concorde sat at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, preparing for a charter flight to New York with 109 people on board, 100 passengers, and 9 crew. It was a hot afternoon. The airplane was close to its maximum takeoff weight, loaded with fuel for the Atlantic crossing. Ahead of them, a large American trijet had taken off from the same runway, runway 26 right. As that airplane accelerated, a small metal strip from one of its engines fell onto the pavement. It was no bigger than a ruler, but it was made of hard metal and lay directly in the Concorde's path. No one in the tower or on the ground saw it. When Flight 4590 was cleared for takeoff, the 4 engines pushed the slender white jet forward down the runway. Concorde needed high speed to fly, so the takeoff roll was long. Everything looked normal until the main wheels reached the section of pavement where the strip was lying. One of the tires ran over it at high speed. The metal piece sliced into the rubber, the tire exploded, and heavy chunks were thrown upward into the wing. On most jets, a burst tire tears off some rubber and maybe bends some metal. On Concorde, the force of the impact sent a shock wave through the wing that ruptured a fuel tank. Jet fuel sprayed out of the underside of the left wing. A second later, it ignited, probably from hot parts near the landing gear or an electrical arc. A sheet of flame streamed back along the fuselage as the aircraft continued its takeoff run. The crew heard bangs and felt the airplane yaw to one side. Engine instruments started to fluctuate. They had already passed the point on the runway where they could safely stop. Rejecting the takeoff at that speed would almost certainly have led to an overrun. The only option was to lift off and try to deal with the emergency in the air. The Concorde rotated and left the ground with fire pouring from the left wing and at least one engine losing power. Witnesses on the ground filmed a plume of orange flame stretching behind the airplane as it struggled to climb. Inside the cockpit, warnings lit up. One engine had lost thrust, another was unreliable, and systems on the left side were being damaged by heat. The crew declared an emergency and asked to divert to Le Bourget, a closer airport on the other side of Paris. But the jet was in a very fragile state, heavy, burning, asymmetric in thrust, and with fuel pouring from a ruptured tank. From the outside, people on the ground saw the Concorde climbing only slowly, nose high and wing low, with the fire never going out. The airspeed never rose to a safe margin above stall. As they tried to turn toward Le Bourget, the damaged engines could not provide enough power to keep the airplane climbing. The nose pitched up further, the left wing dropped, and the Concorde began to roll and sink. Seconds later, the aircraft stalled. It rolled left, lost what lift it had, and fell toward the town of Gonesse, just beyond the airport boundary. At 16:44 local time, Air France flight slammed almost vertically into a small hotel and restaurant complex, erupting in a massive fireball. Everyone on board died instantly. 4 people on the ground were also killed. The impact and fire destroyed the building and left a scar of blackened rubble where it had stood. Investigators later traced the chain of events back to that one metal strip on the runway and to the design of Concorde's fuel tanks and tires. The airplane had no protection against large tire fragments slamming into the underside of the wing, and the tanks were not lined to resist penetration. Once the fuel escaped, there was no system to smother a fire of that intensity near the landing gear and engines. A piece of hardware from another aircraft, a burst tire, a ruptured tank, and a loss of control only minutes after brake release. The crash of flight ended the myth that Concorde was untouchable. The fleet was grounded while major modifications were made. Stronger, more resilient tires, Kevlar liners inside the fuel tanks to stop debris from punching holes, and changes to wiring and hydraulic lines in vulnerable areas. Concorde did eventually return to service for a short time, but passenger confidence never fully recovered. Just a few years later, the type was retired for good. For many people, this flight is remembered in a single image, a white supersonic jet clawing into the air with a cone of fire stretching from its wing, moments before it rolls and disappears behind the buildings of a French suburb. It is one of the clearest examples of how a takeoff can be lost not by a huge storm or a gross pilot error, but by a tiny piece of metal in exactly the wrong place on exactly the wrong day. National Airlines Flight 102 was a heavy military cargo run at the end of a long war. On April 29th, 2013, a jumbo cargo jet lined up to depart Bagram airfield in Afghanistan, bound first for Dubai and then on to the United States. On board were 7 crew members. In the main deck cargo hold behind them sat several enormous armored vehicles, the kind of mine-resistant trucks used on patrols in Afghanistan, each weighing many tons. Loading that kind of cargo is not like putting pallets into a normal freighter. Every vehicle has to be chained and strapped down in multiple directions, so it cannot move even a few centimeters. At Bagram, those restraints were not good enough. Some tie-down points were not used. Some chains and straps were routed poorly, and the airplane was dispatched with a load that looked secure on paper, but was not capable of holding those vehicles in the most critical moments of flight. From the cockpit, the start of the takeoff looked routine. The 4 engines pushed the big jet down the runway, the nose lifted, and the airplane began to climb. Outside the base, a driver on a service road happened to be filming with a dash cam. His video would become one of the most shocking pieces of real aviation footage on the internet. At first, the jumbo climbs normally. Then, within seconds, the nose pitches up far steeper than it should. Instead of a shallow departure, the airplane rears back, almost like a rocket. That extreme nose-up attitude was the moment when the load in the back broke loose. As the jet rotated, some of the armored vehicles rolled or shifted aft, smashing into structure at the rear, damaging systems, and pushing the center of gravity sharply toward the tail. The result was an airplane that suddenly wanted to stand on its tail. In the cockpit, there was almost no time to react. A jet that is too far tail-heavy becomes very difficult to control. The elevators and trim no longer have their normal authority. The crew tried to push the nose down and add power, but the airplane was already slow, already near the limits of what its wings could support at that attitude. On the dashcam, you can see it hanging in the air, nose high, wings wobbling. Then the stall comes. The left wing drops, the nose falls through, and the entire airplane rolls toward the ground. In a few more seconds, the jet disappears behind buildings and a low ridgeline at the end of the runway. A huge fireball rises up, followed by thick black smoke. The impact zone is inside the base perimeter, near a road and some storage areas. There are no survivors. All 7 crew members are killed instantly. There is no sign of a long, shallow glide or a controlled turnback. No mayday call that leads to a planned emergency landing. The entire sequence from liftoff to impact takes less than a minute. It is a pure takeoff failure, driven not by engines or weather, but by what was happening to the weight in the back of the airplane. Investigators later found smashed tie-down fittings, broken floor locks, and heavy damage in the rear of the fuselage that matched the idea of vehicles slamming backward. They concluded that at least some of the armored trucks had come loose. collided with the bulkhead and structure, and shifted the center of gravity so far aft that the airplane could no longer be kept within a safe pitch and speed range. The load plan, the way the restraints were chosen, and the oversight of that process all came under harsh criticism. National Airlines Flight 102 is one of the clearest modern examples of how takeoff performance is not just about runway length and engine power. A fully loaded cargo jet can have perfect weather, all 4 engines running and a long runway, and still be doomed if the weight inside is not secured properly. British Airways Flight 2276 was a routine long-haul departure that turned into a runway fire in front of a terminal full of cameras. On 8 September 2015, a British Airways wide-body jet was preparing to leave Las Vegas for London with around 170 people on board. It was late afternoon at Las Vegas McCarran International Airport. The airplane taxied out and lined up for departure on runway 07 left, pointing into the desert haze. Inside, passengers were settling in for the overnight flight, cabin lights dimmed, safety demo done. The pilots advanced the thrust levers and the 2 large engines wound up to takeoff power. The jet began to accelerate, gathering speed along the runway. For the first few seconds, everything felt normal. Then, just as the airplane passed through high speed on the takeoff roll, there was a violent bang from the left side. In the cockpit, warnings lit up. The left engine instruments dropped, and fire alarms sounded. The crew felt the airplane yaw as power on one side vanished. Out the windows of the terminal, people saw a burst of flame from the left engine as the jet rolled past. The tower called the crew to say there was fire visible. The captain rejected the takeoff, pulled the thrust levers to idle, and deployed maximum braking. The airplane screeched to a halt on the runway with a trail of rubber and smoke behind it. By then, the situation on the left side was deteriorating quickly. The failure in the engine had been uncontained. Internal parts had broken and punched through the engine case, damaging the wing and puncturing fuel lines. Fuel sprayed into the hot area and ignited. A large fire developed under and behind the left wing, licking up the side of the fuselage. In the cockpit, the pilots shut down the left engine, pulled its fire handle, and discharged extinguishers. But the flames outside did not go out. Heat began to enter the cabin along the left side. The crew did not know how long the structure and fuel tanks would hold. The captain ordered an immediate evacuation. Cabin crew opened doors on the right side first, away from the fire, and deployed the slides. Some exits on the left were kept closed because of the flames. At the same time, the right engine was still running for a short period, sending jet blast across the runway. That made some slides flap dangerously and created more noise and confusion until the pilots shut it down as well. Passengers poured into the aisles. Many followed instructions and left everything behind. Some, famously, tried to take carry-on bags with them, slowing the flow and crowding the exits. On the runway, people slid down onto the asphalt and ran away from the airplane in small groups, gathering near the edge of the runway under the direction of firefighters and ground staff. Airport fire crews arrived very quickly and began spraying foam onto the left wing and engine area. Flames that had been towering above the fuselage were knocked down within minutes. Thick black smoke still rose over the airport, but the main fuel fire was under control. From the terminal windows and the apron, ground staff and passengers watched the entire scene unfold almost in real time. Everyone got out. There were injuries, mostly smoke inhalation and slide injuries, but no one on board was killed. The airplane, however, was badly damaged. The fire burned through the wing and fuselage skin on the left side, melted structure and wiring, and left the jet sitting scarred and blackened on the runway. It was later written off and dismantled. The investigation found that the core of the accident was not a crew error, but a mechanical failure deep inside the left engine. A critical rotating part in the compressor had developed a hidden crack over time. Eventually, it failed at takeoff power, came apart, and threw metal out through the engine case. That debris cut fuel and systems in the wing and started the fire. The report criticized how the part had been designed, inspected, and tracked over its life, and called for better inspection methods and design changes. At the same time, the way the crew handled the emergency was praised. The decision to reject the takeoff, the quick shutdown of the engine, and the order to evacuate likely prevented a far worse outcome. The evacuation also triggered a wider discussion about passenger behavior, after images showed people carrying luggage down the slides while flames were still burning. Singapore Airlines. Flight 006 was a long-haul night flight caught at exactly the wrong place, in exactly the wrong weather. On the night of October 31st, 2000, a Boeing jumbo jet was preparing to leave Taipei for Los Angeles, with 179 people on board. It was the second leg of a route from Singapore. Outside, a typhoon was brushing past Taiwan. Heavy rain, gusty winds, and low visibility turned the airport into a blur of lights and reflections. The crew were cleared to depart from runway 05 right. At Chiang Kai-shek Airport, there were 2 parallel runways, 05 right, which was open, and 05 left, which was closed for construction. 05 left had parts of its surface dug up, work vehicles parked on it, and heavy concrete barriers placed across it. In clear weather, the closure markers and construction would have been obvious. In a typhoon at night, with sheets of rain across the windscreen, nothing was obvious. Guided by taxi instructions and their airport diagram, the pilots turned toward what they believed was the active runway. The parallel strips lay close together. Taxiway's centerline lights, runway markings, and closure crosses were all there, but in the dark, in the rain, and under time pressure, the picture they built in their minds was wrong. Instead of lining up on the open runway 05 right, the jet rolled onto the closed runway 05 left. From the cockpit, the view was poor. Streaks of water, glare, and a narrow cone of light from the landing lamps. The crew did not see any construction equipment ahead. They did not see the concrete barriers and machinery parked farther down the closed pavement. The tower, with no active ground radar scanning the runways that night, saw only a departure cleared from runway 05 right and had no clear picture of the jumbo's actual position. Cleared for takeoff, the pilots advanced the throttles. The 4 engines spooled up to full power, and the airplane began to accelerate. In the cabin, passengers felt nothing unusual. They were strapped in, lights dimmed, expecting a long night across the Pacific. Outside, the jet roared down a runway that was never meant to be used. As speed built, the airplane passed the first set of construction lights and barriers. At that point, there was already too little runway left to safely abort without going off the far end. Seconds later, still below rotation speed but moving fast, the right side of the airplane slammed into the first major obstruction. A line of concrete blocks and construction vehicles parked across the closed strip. The right wing and right-hand engines struck the obstacles at high speed. Metal tore open, fuel tanks ruptured. The wing began to break apart, and a fireball erupted along the side of the airplane. From the cabin, people on the right saw a sudden orange flash and felt the entire aircraft lurch and twist. The pilots attempted to reject the takeoff, pulling the power back and applying full braking, but the damage was already catastrophic. The jumbo broke into large pieces as it skidded down the runway. The fuselage split and caught fire. Sections of the cabin were gutted almost immediately by flames. Others stayed relatively intact, but filled quickly with smoke. When the motion stopped, part of the wreck lay tilted on its side in the rain, burning fiercely in several places as jet fuel poured across the concrete. Inside, some passengers were already unconscious or trapped by collapsed seats and debris. Others fought with jammed seatbelts and overhead bins. Flight attendants who had survived the impact tried to open usable exits, shout instructions, and get people away from the smoke and fire. On the outside, airport fire crews raced to the scene, driving into a wall of heat and rain. Out of 179 people on board, 83 died, most of them in the forward and right side sections of the airplane where the impact and fire were worst. 96 survived, many with serious burns or injuries, pulled out through broken fuselage sections and the few exits that could still be opened. For a crash that violent, in a fire that intense, the number of survivors surprised even some investigators. The core question was brutally simple. How did a modern airliner, flown by an experienced crew, end up taking off from a closed, obstructed runway? The answer lay in a chain of human and airport factors, not in a single moment of carelessness. The weather was terrible. Visibility was low. The parallel runways were close together, and their taxi access points could be confusing at night. Some closure markings and lights on the blocked runway were not as clear and redundant as they later would be required to be. The crew did not cross-check all the cues available to them, and ground controllers did not have a real-time surface radar picture to catch the error. Singapore Airlines Flight 006 became a textbook case of a wrong runway accident. After Taipei, airports and regulators around the world tightened rules on how closed runways must be marked and lit, how ground movements are monitored in bad weather, and how crews brief and confirm runway alignment before takeoff. More emphasis was placed on using every available cue, heading on the instruments, signs, painted numbers on the pavement, not just habit and expectation. British Airtours Flight 28 was supposed to be a simple holiday charter out of Manchester. On 22 August 1985, a Boeing 737 was getting ready to depart for Corfu with 137 people on board. It was an ordinary gray British morning. Passengers had their shorts and sunglasses packed, cabin crew were doing the safety demonstration, and the jet lined up on runway 24 for takeoff. At first, the roll felt normal. The engines came up to power, the airplane began to accelerate, and the runway lights streaked past under the nose. Then, just as the jet was gathering speed, the left engine suffered a violent failure. Metal fragments tore out of the side of the engine and punched into the wing. One fragment ruptured a fuel tank. Jet fuel sprayed out and ignited almost immediately in the slipstream. A sheet of flame blew back along the left side of the airplane. In the cockpit, the crew heard bangs, saw instruments flicker, and felt the airplane yaw. They rejected the takeoff, brought the thrust levers back to idle, and applied maximum braking. The jet stayed on the ground and came to a stop on the runway. From a distance, it looked like a successful abort with an engine fire. In reality, it was the beginning of one of the deadliest cabin fires in aviation history. While the airplane sat still, the fire outside grew. Flames wrapped around the rear fuselage and began to burn through the skin. Heat and toxic smoke pushed into the cabin from the back, first as a smell, then as a dark cloud. Passengers seated near the rear windows saw orange light and felt heat on the walls. Many people were still waiting for clear instructions, thinking the situation was under control because the airplane was no longer moving. At the front, the cabin crew opened the main left door and started evacuating. People surged forward into the narrow aisle. Very quickly, a human bottleneck formed near the front galley. Those further back could not see what was happening. Some stood up into the thickening smoke and lost their sense of direction. Others crouched low, trying to stay under the smoke layer, but there was nowhere to go. The right forward door was not opened immediately, and the rear doors on the left side were being attacked by fire. Overwing exits could have made a huge difference, but they were small and not well understood by most passengers. On one side, smoke and fire outside the wing made them seem unusable. On the other, people hesitated, struggled with the heavy hatch, and were unsure how to move out onto the wing in the chaos. Seconds mattered, and those seconds were being lost to confusion and poor layout. Inside the rear cabin, conditions deteriorated with shocking speed. Modern cabin interiors of the time met flammability rules, but the plastics, fabrics, and adhesives gave off thick, toxic smoke when they burned. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Passengers collapsed in the aisle and over the seats. Many died not from burns, but from inhaling superheated, poisonous gases before they ever reached an exit. Outside, the airport fire service arrived quickly and attacked the blaze with foam. They managed to knock down the main external fire, but for dozens of people inside, it was already too late. In the end, 55 of the 137 occupants died, most of them toward the rear of the cabin. 82 survived, many with injuries and burns, pulled out through the front door, the right side, and the overwing exits that did manage to open. Investigators found that the engine failure and fuel fire were the trigger, but the scale of the tragedy came from what happened inside. Narrow aisles, seats too close together near exits, materials that produced dense, toxic smoke, and an evacuation that funneled too many people toward too few usable doors. British Airtours Flight 28 became the turning point for cabin safety. After this accident, regulators changed how many seats can be placed near an exit, how wide evacuation routes must be, and what materials are allowed in the cabin. Low-level floor lighting became standard so people can find exits even when smoke hides the ceiling signs. Crew training for fast, decisive door use was strengthened. Interior materials were redesigned to burn more slowly and give off less smoke. Emirates Flight 521 was meant to be a routine morning arrival into Dubai. On August 3, 2016, a wide-body jet from Thiruvananthapuram, India, approached Dubai International Airport with roughly 300 people on board. It was a hot summer day, with high temperatures and gusty winds blowing across the desert. The crew set up to land on runway 12 left. On final approach, the landing looked normal from the outside. Gear down, flaps set, the airplane lined up with the runway and descended through the heat haze. In the cockpit, though, the crew were fighting changing winds and a higher-than-ideal approach speed. As they crossed the threshold, the jet was slightly fast and floated longer than planned. Instead of touching down firmly near the touchdown zone, it stayed in the air, eating up runway. When they finally did make contact with the runway, it was a gentle bounce touchdown, not a solid arrival. The main gear touched, then lifted off again. In those few seconds, the crew made a critical decision. Rather than commit to a landing and ride out the bounce, the captain called for a go-around, essentially abandoning the landing and trying to climb away for another attempt. On most days, a go-around from low height is a straightforward maneuver. Push the thrust levers up, pitch the nose to a climb attitude, retract the gear, and flap step by step, and fly away. Here, the timing and the airplane's state worked against them. The go-around was initiated after the first touchdown, when the auto-throttle system was no longer automatically adding power. The pilots moved the controls for a climb and began to raise the landing gear, but the thrust never came up to full go-around power. The airplane was still heavy, still hot, and now had less lift while its engines remained near idle. From outside, it looked as if the jet tried to lift off again, then stalled near the ground. It climbed a few meters, slowed, and then sank back toward the runway with the landing gear folding under it. With the gear no longer fully supporting the weight, the airplane hit the runway hard on its belly, engines and underside scraping along the concrete. Sparks and debris flew as the jet slid down the runway, showering the area with metal fragments. Fuel tanks in the wings and center section were ripped open. As the sliding wreckage ground to a halt, a fire broke out and quickly grew, feeding on the spilled fuel. Flames wrapped around the fuselage and thick black smoke rose over the airport. Inside, the cabin filled with the sounds of impact, then the smell of smoke and the sight of fire outside the windows. The crew ordered an immediate evacuation. Cabin staff opened usable doors and deployed slides, especially on the side away from the worst of the flames. Passengers surged into the aisles. Some followed instructions and left everything behind. Others tried to pull carry-on bags from the overhead bins, slowing the flow and clogging exits while the clock ticked down on how long the structure would hold. On the tarmac, airport fire crews reached the scene in under a minute. They began blasting the fuselage and wings with foam, trying to knock back the flames as people slid down and ran away from the airplane. In videos taken from the terminal and the apron, you can see the jet sitting on its belly, fire venting from the top of the fuselage, and streams of passengers scattering across the runway with smoke towering above them. Remarkably, almost everyone on board escaped the burning aircraft. Dozens were injured, many with smoke inhalation and slide injuries, and at least one passenger later died from those injuries. A firefighter on the ground was also killed when a fuel tank exploded during the firefight. The airplane itself was destroyed. Investigators later found that there was no single hidden mechanical defect that made the accident inevitable. The engines and systems were capable of producing go-around power. The core problem was the sequence of decisions and actions in those last seconds. A bounced landing, a late go-around initiated after touchdown, and a failure to advance the thrust levers enough to give the airplane the power it needed to climb away in the punishing Dubai heat. Once the gear was retracted and the thrust remained low, there was no margin left. Aeromexico Connect, Flight 2431, was a short evening hop that turned into one of the strangest kinds of crash story. A wrecked airplane and no lives lost. On 31st July 2018, a regional jet was scheduled to fly from Durango to Mexico City with 103 people on board, 99 passengers and 4 crew. It was late afternoon at Durango's Guadalupe Victoria Airport. Thunderstorms were passing over the field, bringing heavy rain, gusty winds, and low cloud. Between cells, the tower tried to keep traffic moving. Flight 2431 was cleared for takeoff on runway 18. As the airplane lined up, rain streaked across the windows. Visibility was still just good enough to depart, but the weather was unstable. In the cockpit, the crew advanced the thrust levers, and the regional jet began its takeoff roll. Passengers felt the usual push back into their seats. Outside, sheets of rain blew across the runway, and the wind shifted in strength and direction. The jet accelerated and reached rotation speed. The nose lifted and the wheels left the ground. For a second or two, it looked like any normal departure. Then they flew into the heart of a powerful gust front coming off the storm near the airport. The wind changed suddenly from headwind to tailwind. Airspeed dropped, lift collapsed, and the airplane could no longer climb. From the cockpit, it felt as if someone had grabbed the jet and pulled it down. The nose was up, but the speed was bleeding away. Stall protection activated. The crew tried to react, but they were only a few meters above the ground with no room to trade height for speed. The airplane mushed back toward the runway environment, unable to climb clear of the storm's downdraft. The jet slammed back onto the ground beyond the runway, hard enough to tear off landing gear and damage the wings. It slid through the grass and scrub, plowing a rough path away from the airport. One wing struck the ground. Fuel tanks were ruptured and parts of the structure broke away. When the motion finally stopped, the airplane was sitting in a shallow depression, twisted and damaged, with its tail section partly separated. Inside the cabin, the impact was violent. Overhead bins burst open, panels cracked, the lights went out. Some passengers were thrown against the seats in front of them. Others found themselves covered in dust and insulation. For a moment, there was shock and silence, then shouting and crying as people realized they were still alive. Almost immediately, smoke and the smell of fuel began to enter the cabin. Outside, a fire had started near one of the wings. Flames were still small, but everyone on board knew that would not last. The flight attendants moved quickly, opening exits and shouting commands. Slides were not usable in the rough field. So many passengers jumped down from doors and overwing exits straight into the wet grass. Phone videos taken in those minutes show people stumbling away from the wreck in the rain, some barefoot, some carrying children, others calling out for relatives and friends. The crew tried to keep people moving upwind and away from the fuselage. Within a short time, emergency vehicles from the airport reached the site, but by then, most of the self-evacuation had already happened. A few minutes after the last people got clear, the fire grew. Flames spread along the wing and into the fuselage. Dark smoke rose over the field as the cabin burned out. Watching the wreck from a distance, it would have been hard to believe that anyone had walked away from it. Yet all 103 occupants had escaped before the flames fully took hold. There were injuries, and some of them were serious. Dozens of people were taken to local hospitals with fractures, burns, and smoke inhalation. The captain suffered severe spinal injuries, but no one died. In an accident that destroyed the airplane, the survival rate was 100%. Investigators later pointed to the weather and the takeoff decision as key factors. The airplane encountered a sudden loss of airspeed and lift in a storm cell that was still too close to the departure path. At the same time, the crew's handling of the takeoff and their response to the rapidly changing conditions did not match ideal wind shear procedures. It was the kind of borderline situation where, on another day, the crew might simply have waited for the storm to move, at the cost of a delay but not at the risk of a crash. The moment an airplane starts its takeoff roll is the point where there is the least room for error. It is heavy with fuel. It is close to the ground. The engines are at maximum power. The runway is a fixed length, and the choices are simple. You either get enough speed and lift to fly or you do not. In this documentary, we stayed in that narrow slice of time. We did not go up to cruise. We looked only at the seconds when wheels are still close to the ground and there is almost no height to trade for speed. Concorde leaving Paris, a cargo jumbo in Afghanistan, a holiday jet in Madrid, a frozen Boeing in Washington, a wrong runway in Taipei, a runway fire in Manchester, an engine explosion in Las Vegas, a failed go-around in Dubai, and a stormy takeoff in Durango. Different airports, different airlines, different eras. Same fragile phase of flight. What these stories show together is that takeoff failures almost never come from one dramatic cause by itself. They come from combinations. A small metal strip left on a runway meets a supersonic airliner with full tanks. A cargo hold full of armored vehicles meets tie-downs that are not strong enough. A maintenance deferral in a cockpit meets a rushed taxi checklist. A snowy day meets crews who do not fully trust their instruments or their de-icing. A closed runway meets poor visibility and a set of assumptions. A contained engine problem meets cabin layouts and materials that cannot handle the smoke. A textbook engine explosion meets a well-trained crew and quick-fire crews. A simple bounce meets a go-around that never gets full thrust. A strong gust front meets a marginal weather decision. Some of these flights ended with almost no survivors. Some ended with almost everyone getting out. One ended with every single person walking away from a destroyed airplane. On paper, they all sit under the same label: takeoff accident. On the ground, they were very different human experiences. A freezing river under a bridge, a crater in a cargo area, a broken jet beside a runway in the rain, a blackened fuselage in desert heat, passengers in shorts and t-shirts running through wet grass, firefighters standing in front of wings that are still burning. For the system, each one turned into changes. Takeoff configuration warnings are now treated as a last line of defense, that must always be powered and checked. Cargo loading rules for very heavy vehicles were rewritten. Crew training for bounce landings and late go-arounds was updated. Wrong runway prevention and surface movement monitoring improved. Cabin materials and evacuation design were tightened after interior fires. Engine inspection and life tracking became stricter. Wind shear and storm departure rules became more conservative at some airports. None of these rules appeared because someone just thought they sounded good. They appeared because a jet did not climb when it should have. For passengers, it can be hard to see that link. You sit down, buckle up, watch the safety demo, and feel the surge of takeoff without thinking about the chain of accidents behind every line in that briefing. When you hear, "leave everything behind" in an evacuation instruction, there is a reason. When the flaps move before takeoff, there is a reason. When the crew waits 10 or 15 minutes for a storm cell to move away from the runway, there is a reason. This video was about those reasons. It is also a reminder that a rejected takeoff or a go-around is not a failure by itself. In most cases, those are the safest decisions the crew can make. The flights in this documentary are the rare edge cases, where there was not enough runway left to stop, not enough height to climb away, or not enough time to correct a bad configuration. They show why pilots are trained to make those decisions early, not at the last second. They show why airlines talk so much about margin, extra runway, extra speed, extra distance from storms. For the families of the people on these flights, none of this turns the clock back. For them, the flight number is not a lesson, it is a loss. The most honest thing we can say from the outside is that their worst days are the reason millions of strangers now take off and land more safely. Every time a crew catches a missed flap setting, every time a loadmaster adds more tie-downs, every time an airport closes a runway more clearly, a small part of these stories is doing quiet work. If you have stayed with this documentary to the end, you are part of a small group of people who want to understand that quiet work, not just watch a few seconds of dramatic video. You are the kind of viewer who listens to the cockpit, follows the investigation, and wants to know what changed afterward. If you want more detailed, calm aviation documentaries like this, you can help in a simple way. Like this video, subscribe to Terra Obscura and tell someone you know who cares about aviation safety and history. It shows the platform that there is an audience for long-form, carefully researched stories about real flights, real crews, and real lessons. And it helps keep these hard-earned lessons from fading, so that the next time an airplane lines up for takeoff, its safety is built on more than luck and a long runway.